Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Freeston. I'm Director of Quality Improvement at the Early Years Alliance, and I am joined for this webinar by my colleague, Melanie Pilcher, Quality and Standards Manager.
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Melanie. For those of you who have been with us on the journey of the Welcome Back series, you'll recall that we started doing these in about May, just when settings were mostly closed, and we were looking to support them with their plans for reopening, how they would support the children, how they would support their staff in their emotional well-beings, and all the logistics of coming back into provision. So we ran a series of webinars at the time, and we sort of planned, as I think everybody was preparing for, is that by the time we got to October, we'd be looking in the rear view mirror at COVID and reflecting back on the experience. But obviously what's come to pass has been completely different, and we are moving into a different mindset now of resilience as much as recovery. For the next foreseeable period, 3, 6, 9, 12 months, however long it takes. So we thought we would take the opportunity to reflect with you on where we are now. But also that is an opportunity, I think, for us all to take stock and reflect on how well the early years sector has responded to the challenges of COVID. And so we want this to be something of a celebration as well as a planning for what comes next. Just to introduce ourselves, for those of you who don't know us, that's me on the left and Melanie on the right. They're your hosts for today.
And no longer blonde, Michael, as a result of lockdown.
Not having seen you for however many months, no longer blonde, yes. So the aims of the session are to reflect on how the sector has responded to providing childcare in these most difficult of times, to consider the challenges that lie ahead through the winter and beyond, and we don't know how long beyond is going to be, to raise awareness of the implications of local lockdowns, Ofsted inspections, all the things we're going to face as we go through the next few months, and to share best practice as we meet the health and well-being needs of children, staff and parents in the coming months. This is very much your session, as all of our webinars are, but we do want to have your comments, considerations and reflections on circumstances that you faced over the period of time. So we want to hear from you, please. How, if at all, has your practice changed? And what changes do you think will endure once restrictions are lifted, whenever that may be? How are you? How are the children? And how are your staff? And also, have you had any of the interim visits from Ofsted that Melanie will explain in due course as we go on, all been involved in the telephone survey? Those were just 3 questions that Melanie and I sort of came up with as we were planning for the session. But if there's any other comments outside of those that you feel as though you'd like to share, when you type in a question into the box, it only comes up on my screen. So don't feel as though you're saying anything that it will be, if your spelling or your grammar is incorrect, that it would be a problem. I then try and weave them into the webinar, hopefully seamlessly, but that's not always the case. And we'll try and address any questions, but also share any comments that you may have. We want the main focus of today to be the practice elements, and Melanie will lead us through those. But I thought it's a useful opportunity to share some numbers to give a sense of where we are now. And it's also an opportunity to promote the CEDAR survey, and autocorrect has made this, has changed this for me. It's the About EY survey, and it's ABOUTEY, all one word. It's on CEDAR's website, and you can just access that via Google. And it does a weekly sample. It receives information from childminders and from PVI settings about the status of their provision. And so the latest figures we have are for the week commencing the 28th of September, so a couple of weeks ago now. 99% of settings are open now, and those in the sample which were not were closed due to self-isolation issues, and I think we'll come on to that as Melanie talks us through local lockdown implications, etc. So all settings are trying to be open for children and families. Average occupancy is static at about 60%. Now that's 60% of maximum occupancy. So obviously high 80s, low 90s is what settings would be aiming for. The sample base there is 352 settings, and you can supply your own information to CEDAR if you wish, just by logging on and becoming one of their respondents. For childminders, the situation is 94% of childminders responded to say they were open. And interestingly there, of the 6% who were closed, not only were there self-isolation issues on the provider themselves, but also low demand from parents. And I think I'll come back to that in a second. Occupancy is at 44% and remaining steady at that level. So again, there are questions about the sustainability that induces as well. And I just thought I would share this graph because that figure of 60, I think I said 66% occupancy in settings shows some huge variations across setting providers. Looking behind the headline average, 17% were operating at least 2/3 of their capacity vacant, whereas at the other end of the scale, 12% had 86% or more. So that huge divergence is something which we will have to really give consideration to over the months coming on, because I mean, clearly operating at a third or only 2/3 of your only 2/3 of your overall occupancy is something that will be a real consideration in due course. I should have said at the beginning, please don't try and write all of this down. We will make all the slides available as ever, and the recording of this session will be available on our YouTube page by the end of the week. So please don't spend ages trying to write everything down. Juliet has just asked a question about, does the 1% include settings that have shut for good or childminders? No, it doesn't, because this is self-reporting, Juliet. So these are ones, I'm assuming, settings who have closed probably aren't responding to the CEDAR's about EY survey, but I'm sure their reasons are being recorded somewhere, but not in this survey. So these are settings that are still operating. Just finally from me, a couple of other issues, because it would be inappropriate to go through where we are now without looking at some of the funding issues that we are facing as we go into the winter. And just to give you a heads up of the work that the Alliance is doing in support of settings. You may be aware that we undertook a freedom of information request to local authorities, asking how many of them were adhering to the government's instruction that they should fund funded places as if the pandemic had not happened. So they instructed local authorities to fund providers until the end of 2020 on the figures that they had back in January, February, I think it was. 1 in 6 said they were not following that guidance. And I understand that further pressure is being applied from the DFE to make them honour that commitment, but it is only an instruction. The funding is done at local authority levels. So I'd be interested to hear from people who feel as though their experience is that they are not getting the full funded rate from their local authority. And also there is the issue that what happens in the spring. So from January onwards, the spring term. As we understand it, the current plan is to go back to funding on actual attendance. But we hope this will be reviewed. If you recall that the original plan was that the funded on historical figures was only meant to be for the summer term, and then it was extended into the autumn term. And one would hope that there is logic to the fact that actually as the pandemic is continuing and occupancy levels are not returning to what was happening before, that actually there is the potential for that to be extended again. But there's no guarantees on that other than the Alliance is gathering the information and will lobby on behalf of the sector. If questions come in on that, I'll try and feed back, but I just wanted to pass those on and then really to hand over to Mel for the main section of today's session, which is from the provider's perspective and from a pedagogy and curriculum perspective of where we are now. Thank you, Mel.
Thank you, Michael. And I hope as we go through this section that you'll, again, as Michael said earlier, just feel free to type in comments or questions and, you know, share what you're doing as well, because it's really interesting to hear what's actually going on out there. So we know that everybody has been really proactive in the way that they've responded to the challenges that we've had. Some of the key things that we're dealing with now, or that we're implementing now: social distancing. It seems that after the initial concerns over how we were going to manage bubbles, people managed to organise their provision, and some of those social distancing things with regard to how you're organising your groups, you've managed to keep in place. How you actually manage to social distance at arrivals and departure times, when you're engaging with parents, all these things. We're hearing some really fantastic examples of that. And actually, one of the things that's been key, I think, to the success of dealing with some of the barriers that we've had is how we've made use of IT systems. A lot of people using the likes of Zoom and Skype to have the contact with parents, to help induct and settling new children, to do virtual show-arounds. All these things that have been targeted at actually just keeping us going. So keeping up to date as well. We know that the guidance changes on an almost daily basis. And it's been so helpful, actually, that the government have now collated all the guidance that's relevant to early years into the one document, the actions for early years and childcare providers during COVID. On previous presentations, we've actually put the link to that on, but I'm sure by now that's something that everybody is using and referring to regularly, and making sure that you are just looking out for those updates as they come along. And how we continually manage to minimise the risk and respond to COVID-19 as well. So, for example, the new procedures that you've put into place around how you deal with an outbreak, new infection control procedures, all of these things now are, I'm not going to say firmly established, but you've had those in place for quite a while, and people are used to working with those things. And it made me reflect on the things, and we've had these conversations amongst our team as well, on the things that will stay in place, the things that we're likely to keep, because actually they're working quite well. And I've heard from settings who are saying that, do you know what, not having parents in the setting has made such a difference. Now, I don't know that I actually agree with that, because I think it goes against the EYFS engaging with parents. But I think what people are thinking of really is about arrivals and departures, certainly arrivals, and how children are coming in under the new systems that are in place and actually just getting on with it. So interesting to hear what anybody's got to say on that one, Michael.
Yes, okay, that is interesting.
It is actually. It's always the way, isn't it, that we say to parents that actually, when they're worried about a child being upset when they leave them, ring us in 10 minutes time and we can guarantee you they'll be absolutely fine. So it's almost like we're cutting out that middle piece of the picture by the children coming in and leaving their parents very much on the doorstep or at the end of the drive. So again, thinking on what we're focusing on now. So these are key issues that we're really at the forefront of our minds now, is certainly issues around safeguarding. I've just been looking at some safeguarding training, actually, that I'm hoping to deliver online next week, and thinking about how certain priorities have not changed so much as got to be approached in a different way. Certainly how we're meeting the needs of vulnerable children, those that maybe we were only slightly worried about prior to lockdown. We've had them back with us for a while now, and actually any concerns that may have escalated during that time will certainly be coming to the fore. And also how we're coping with children with SEND at the moment, as the local authority duties were relaxed again during lockdown. But I think local authorities and other services are still playing catch up with what they can actually provide. So again, interesting to hear from all of you how you're finding your access to and you're working with other services at the moment.
Just to pick up on that point, Melanie, if you don't mind, just a comment that's coming from Juliet, and I think it refers back to the previous one in terms of engagement with parents, but also vulnerable children and SEND. Some feedback from the EAL parents with whom they work. Oh, and my slide is going up. They can find it very lonely and confusing when they themselves are unsure of the information that's being passed through the text. So I think that issue of making sure that you communicate with parents in a way that is appropriate for them and gets the message through is really important on which to reflect.
Yeah, definitely, because it certainly increases, doesn't it, the level of contact that we have with parents at this time and the needs of those parents. So being very responsive to the needs, not just of EAL parents, but any parents indeed that are struggling to make sense of the guidance, as some of us are, to be honest. So yes.
And I also recall anecdotal information that actually low occupancy rates are exacerbated for SEND children. There is a greater heightened situation of children not coming back are those who will have additional needs. And I think that generates its own concerns as well.
It does, and that's certainly the case as we're hearing across the board, really, but parents who are concerned about sending their children back. And again, it's a valuable role that we play in actually reassuring those parents and encouraging those parents to come back with their children where it's appropriate for them to do so.
And just a reflection from Bridget as well here. She really misses being able to have all my slides have been really. Oh no, my slides moved up. When anybody writes a new question, it all moves up, and I miss my train. I really miss being able to have regular face-to-face contact with parents and siblings. We've arranged some outdoor meetings, but our pre-COVID outdoor policy was much more in keeping with our ethos.
Yes. Yeah, and people are using outdoors a lot, aren't they, for meetings and so on. And I think we're all getting quite used to that. And I think we've got to maintain that momentum as the weather changes and think, you know what, actually, with the right clothing and a bit of shelter, these things are still possible. And there's a way around it, isn't there? Because those face-to-face meetings are so important if and when we can manage them. Definitely.
I saw a report that from B&Q, I think it was, that sales of garden parasols have gone through the roof. I think people are planning for outdoor activities in their gardens, and I think the same may be for providers as well.
Definitely. Let's hope we don't have too blustery a winter then in that case.
Yes.
Okay, so another of our focuses at the moment as well is the fact that as of the 25th of September, the disapplications and modifications ended. So from the 26th of September, all settings are expected to be delivering the learning and development requirements of the EYFS in full. Now, there is a grace period of a month, 26th of September to the 26th of November, for safeguarding and welfare only. Actually, that's more than a month, isn't it?
That's 2 months. 2 months. I was going to correct you on that. Yes, 2 months.
Thank you. For the safeguarding and welfare disapplications and modifications. So that was things like the paediatric first aid, designated safeguarding lead, where people couldn't access training, obviously because of the restrictions that were in place. And it acknowledges that there's going to be a backlog, really, and it's going to take time for people actually to be able to access and organise attendance at those training events, which are going to be pretty much online, aren't they?
Just had a question from Anthea. Sorry, Melanie. She's saying, what about disapplications in areas facing greater restrictions? Can we come back to that, Anthea, please? Because we'll cover that in due course. But
we will cover that in due course. Yeah. Yes, yeah, definitely, because that is an issue as well. And of course, maintaining our mental health and well-being when the goalposts keep moving. I think somebody said earlier they're bored with it now, they're fed up with it now. Michael, you said yourself, we thought by now we'd be getting back to some kind of near normal, and yet we're not, and we can't see an end in sight. And I think we have to acknowledge the impact that has on people, not just parents, children, but staff as well. So making sure that actually we're not complacent in making sure that we look after each other and recognise where people are struggling. Okay, if we can move on again. That leads me on nicely to this slide, where I've started by saying that a dynamic situation requires a dynamic response. And this is very much thinking in terms of risk assessment as well, because a dynamic risk assessment is where you have to respond quickly to a situation that's evolving literally in front of your eyes. And I think in some areas, this is how we're dealing with coronavirus. And certainly this, I've just did a screenshot of these updates that were just yesterday posted online. You know, Lancashire, Barrow-in-Furness, Essex, isn't it Yorkshire today as well that's announced that they'll be going into local restrictions from Saturday. So we have to be prepared, but we have to be prepared to respond quickly as well, bearing in mind that local restrictions will vary for each of these areas, as will the alert levels in each of these areas. And I'm going to look at those a little bit more now as we look at some of the tiers of restrictions on the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so there are various tiers of restrictions. So there are levels of alert. For example, in the area that I'm in, we're on a medium alert, and there are very few restrictions in place other than those that are national restrictions anyway. However, in education, there are up to 4 tiers of restrictions in addition. Tier 1, and actually tier 1 to 3, the default position is that education and childcare settings will remain open. An area moving into national intervention with restrictions short of education and childcare closure is described as tier 1. So that's universal.
And that's what everybody is. Everybody is in at least tier 1, aren't they? Where the risk, yes, I think, for my NHS app is that it is moderate in that situation.
Absolutely, yes, that's it. Tiers 2 and 3, early years settings, primary schools and alternative provision, special schools and other specialist settings will continue to allow all children / pupils to attend on site. So pretty much the same business as normal.
Can I just interrupt? Sorry, Melanie. Can I just interrupt? Because yes, Beverly has just put an interesting question, and I'd be interested to know where Beverly is, if you don't mind, because I thought it was a question, but it's a statement. It is likely half term will be extended at short notice. I'd be interested in knowing where you are, Beverly, and whether that's something you've heard locally, or if that's something where we feel as though we might get a Northern Irish situation that, in effect, that's the circuit breaker more nationally. So if she comes back,
it's certainly something that's been discussed, hasn't it, at a national level, but whether this is actually going to be implemented as part of the tiers of restrictions in some areas, as you say, it'd be interesting to know from Beverly where she is and how that applies to her.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted.
That's fine. So in tier 4, all nurseries, childminders, mainstream schools, colleges and other educational establishments allow full-time attendance on site only to priority groups, vulnerable children and the children of critical workers. So that basically is as we were back in March when we went into lockdown, isn't it? That actually nurseries were allowed to, or were encouraged to open for those vulnerable children and the children of key workers.
Can I just explore that, and just for people's benefit? I was pushing back with Melanie on this in due course, because I'd heard the phrase tier 4 some time ago, and I think it was just in an Ofsted meeting. Where do people go to find out? Because we don't talk about tier 4, even all the challenges around Manchester and South Yorkshire now, yes, and the rest of the North East. That's tier 3. And we seem to have that green or sort of amber, red and redder situation for tiers 1, 2 and 3. Is there public discussion around tier 4 at the moment? And where do people go to find out more information about it?
Well, I'm hoping, Michael, if we've got our ducks in order here, that the next slide will actually take you to the link.
Okay, great. And just Beverly has come back. She's in the London Borough of Sutton, and she did say London Borough of Sutton, so she's near me. And she did mean to say, is it likely? So as a question, Beverly, as far as we know, we haven't heard. This was being discussed a few weeks ago, but then all the conversations around circuit breakers seemed to go away. But then they suddenly came back up again with Northern Ireland in the first instance. So we'll see. But as we know, going into half term for most places from this Friday, I certainly haven't heard anything, and I haven't seen anything on the local news. Sharon has said, will settings be able to choose if they are open or not if they are in tier 4, Melanie?
Oh, no.
Right.
No, it will be a case of you will be encouraged to stay open to offer childcare to those vulnerable children and the children of critical workers. So it won't be a case. So if you're going to stay open, yes, you can choose to stay open or choose to close, but you can't choose basically who you're offering childcare to. It will be limited to those two groups.
Oh, I see. Right. So we're back to that situation we had during full lockdown in terms of viability
Yes.
and local decisions. Yes.
Yeah, you won't be able to choose to open fully, let's put it that way, as in open to everybody. And I think, again, with response to the situation over whether half term will be extended, the government has been very keen to try and put some of these decisions back into the hands of the local authorities. So these decisions will be made on the level of need in your area and the circumstances in your local area. Okay, we can move on, Michael, to that next
yes,
slide.
I'm getting some really interesting comments on all of this, and I'll try and do them justice as we go through. Melanie, yes, please.
Okay, so I've put the link up here for you. It is so unique to local circumstances. I think it's really important that everybody does actually visit this link and actually see how this applies in their area. There may be exceptional circumstances in which some level of restriction to educational childcare is required in a local area. In other words, Tier 4 being implemented. That will be done very much on the basis of risk assessment, that dynamic risk assessment that I mentioned earlier. So you could still be in a medium risk area, but have those additional tiers put in place based on the local circumstances.
And just from a particular point, Shanaz has asked from her situation, and I think this is the question about local things. I live in London Borough of Barnet, but I work in Hitchin. I am wondering if I'll be able to continue going to work if there are different tiers for both places.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting.
If I think about it at the moment, I'm just thinking about the Welsh situation where people aren't meant to travel in. You can travel into Wales for work, can't you? And I know that's probably a long way from Hitchin, but I'm just thinking about if there's any logic of comparison between circumstances.
Yes, and as you know, Michael, I live quite close to the Welsh border, but I certainly wouldn't be able to go for a day trip. But if I was working in the area, then yes, certainly I'd still be able to go in. And again, it's that idea of local restrictions, looking at your local authority website as well to see how they're interpreting those restrictions.
I'm just I'm pausing a bit because we've had a thing sent in from Debbie, which actually outlines. She must have. I'm assuming she's cut and pasted this straight from the website because otherwise she's got a photographic memory. And if you don't mind, I'll just read it. In the exceptional circumstances where some local level of restriction, this is all the information you said. But under the Coronavirus Act 2020, ultimately the decision to order the closure of school and childcare settings is one for central government. Decisions will need to be made on a case-by-case basis in the light of local circumstance, including information about the incidence and transmission of coronavirus. Attendance may therefore need to be restricted in different ways, etc., etc. So it is there, and I think that's taken from exactly the same link as you've got on the slide. So people will be able to explore that at their leisure.
Yes, I recognise that wonderfully complex government speak as you were reading that out, Michael. So thank you for that.
So thank you. People are on the case. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think really the key messages here is that just as, you know, the local authority have got to respond dynamically, so have we, and just being ready and having everything in place, ready to respond to those circumstances as and when they arrive. A real challenge for us all. But, you know, we've been doing it since March. This is the thing, especially early years and childcare sector, have come up trumps every time, and we've managed to respond, we've managed to change our ways of working, and so that we can keep going. We've done it up until now, and we've just got to keep this momentum up. We've got to keep this level of energy going as well.
Thank you.
And that's my rallying cry, Michael. If we can move on to the next slide.
Have a gin, Mel.
Yes, I think I probably will. Okay, so yeah, and so we haven't had to worry or think too much about Ofsted either, have we? So I thought it would be useful to give you a bit of an update on where Ofsted are now and what's going on. So from September to December then, we're talking about interim visits being made by Ofsted to settings that are currently judged to be requires improvement or inadequate. And the purpose of those interim visits will be for Ofsted to compile a report that tells them or tells others, including the local authority, so because obviously this has an impact on funding, that you are now meeting any safeguarding and welfare requirements that were imposed upon you. So actions that were imposed upon you, you have the opportunity to show that you are now meeting them or you're making good progress towards them.
But I'm right in thinking that that isn't a full report, is it? That isn't an inspection visit leading to a change in grade.
No, there is no judgment made, so you won't go from requires improvement to good or to outstanding. Certainly no judgment is made, and the report is for you and Ofsted, and you'd be able to show it to the local authority, right, as you said, or to parents who are...
And so you're trying to use it as persuasive to the local authority for example, with 2-year-old funding.
Yes,
but it isn't. So yes, you'd hope that they would be persuaded by that documentation.
Definitely, because Ofsted have no powers to tell the local authority they've got to accept it, because obviously as the funding holders, local authority make those decisions based on the information that they have to hand.
Thank you.
Now, the other thing that Ofsted have been busily doing during this time is conducting a telephone survey, and this is pretty random in how they're actually targeting providers. So you may receive a phone call from Ofsted just asking some questions about how you're doing, what barriers you're facing, how you've overcome those barriers, what the impact has been on quality and practice in your setting. And again, this is simply an information gathering exercise from Ofsted. The answers that you give will remain anonymous, so they won't be used against you in any way, so you can be completely honest about how you're coping. But what Ofsted will do is to compile that information together, and they can actually then share it with the government and also use it to inform how they move forward in terms of what inspections might look like when they actually resume and how they will prioritise those inspections. The other thing to remember is that throughout lockdown and beyond, Ofsted has maintained its responsibility for compliance and enforcement. So where they've received complaints or concerns about a setting that's currently operating, they still have the right to actually come in and inspect and to investigate and to actually apply actions against you should they need to, and that includes actually revoking registration if that was necessary. In preparation for January, between now and then, Ofsted are also going to review the inspection framework and possibly other documents with the thinking in mind that some things will have to change when they do start those inspections again from January. So as it stands at the moment, Ofsted intend to resume the inspection schedule from January, and they will pick up where they left off. So they will be prioritising those settings that are overdue, those settings for whom they have concerns, but actually, and also those settings perhaps in newer registrations that are actually now due that Ofsted inspection visit. So that's how they're going to move forward from January. But of course, with the situation as it is, we still have to put a question mark against that.
Thank you, Melanie. I've spent the last minute or two trying to work out the question from Donna, and it's linked the inspection reports and visits with your safeguarding and the disapplications. What she's getting at here is difficulty in accessing safeguarding training at the moment. So her question is, if the interim visit happens after the 26th of November, so when the disapplications have gone, or the transition period, how does that work if you can't get safeguarding or paediatric first aid updated, as there have been no places available or there's no blended training? How's that going to affect? That's a really good question. It's because we are getting lots of reports in terms of people saying, I just physically cannot update my safeguarding certificates because I can't get a place.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's two parts to that really, because the focus of the interim visits will simply be the actions that are already against you. So if Ofsted, if your requires improvement or inadequate, and you have currently got safeguarding and welfare actions that have been imposed on you by Ofsted, that is what the focus of those interim visits will be.
But take it a stage further, Melanie. If this is in January, if the supply side of safeguarding training doesn't change over the autumn, we could be going into January's inspection visits with still people unable to have updated their safeguarding certificates or paediatric first aid, or parents might actually complain to Ofsted that they're conscious that standards are slipping, and it might trigger an inspection that way.
Yeah, and there's two sides to this as well. As we mentioned earlier, there is the option for the disapplications and modifications to be reinstated if you go into local lockdown, or where you are in an area where there are tiers of restrictions that mean it is not possible for you to actually meet all those safeguarding and welfare requirements with regard to accessing training, and possibly with regard to things like ratios as well. As you know, one of the disapplications or one of the modifications that was made to the safeguarding and welfare requirements.
Might I suggest that it's in the interests of providers to keep track of the attempts they've made to book on to safeguarding training or identify, so that you've got that evidence to be able to present to anybody who asks the question, whether that's parents or whether it's Ofsted inspectors, to actually say, we have been trying, however, supply is severely limited, and so we have not been successful.
Yeah, this is about showing that you've made best endeavours to actually meet those requirements. And if there are limitations to actually doing that because the training simply isn't out there or simply isn't accessible, then as Michael said, being able to show how you've made those best endeavours to actually get on that training and to plug the gaps as well. So for example, with the paediatric first aid, at one point we were saying that, or Ofsted was saying that actually if you couldn't book onto a paediatric first aid course, then you could actually, I think it was St John's Ambulance that were actually doing free online training.
Free online training, which is a brush up for your skills and knowledge, available from our colleagues at St John's Ambulance.
Yeah, so being able to demonstrate to Ofsted that actually you'd access that free training, that you'd updated your staff, that you know, again, you've done everything that you possibly can to plug the gaps where they are, I think is going to be the thing. And in fairness now, there is an awful lot happening online. People are getting up to speed, training providers are getting up to speed with that now, and are actually making more and more training available online. Just as we've had to, you know, there's more of our training that we're putting online, acknowledging that we're not going to be able to do it face to face. So I think you've just got to be aware of what's available, how it's going to work for you in your setting, and being able to show that you're trying to access it.
I do have to do a shameless plug here, in as much that the Alliance is in partnership with St John's, offering a blended learning version of the main paediatric first aid, paediatric first aid courses. So details are available on our website. And Sharon's comment is, this is a good reason why it's good to stagger all your staff's training throughout the year and at the period, so that they don't all come up at the same time.
That's a really good point, isn't it? And it's one of those things, I think, that as we move forward, we're going to have to keep in place. A lot of settings would say they'd rather get the training all done in one hit, you know, and train the whole team at the same time. And in normal circumstances, that works for many people. But I think the idea of staggering training so that you've always got enough paediatric first aid, designated person and so on, and backup designated persons whose training is up to date is really important.
And the other point Janet has just made is the other benefit of online training in this area is the difficulty in letting staff have time off for training. Yes, absolutely, yes. Janet.
And again, it's another of those things that to some extent is going to be here to stay. I mean, some of us are, yes, we are fed up of not seeing people face to face, but we also acknowledge actually the convenience of online training is well, it goes without question, really. It's so much easier that people can access training as and when they want to and don't have to leave their setting or their home to do so.
Yeah.
All right, so we're left then with January will be upon us before we know it. So we know that the inspection framework is being reviewed now. It's not going to change radically, but I think it's just about some of the things that are going to have to be put in there to acknowledge the current situation and the possibility of lockdown. One of the things that Ofsted has already done is changed its deferral policy. So as most of you will know, you do have the right in certain circumstances to defer your Ofsted inspection when you receive that inspection telephone call. And one of the reasons now that you can actually defer will be that you are in an area where there are now local restrictions or local lockdown. So that's one of the documents that has already been changed. Okay.
And I noticed it as well. So that I'm assuming that reflects the fact that we don't know where the world will be in January.
We certainly don't. And one of the things that I hadn't realised was that a lot of Ofsted's inspectors have actually been seconded to other government departments, or certainly were through lockdown. And Ofsted have had trouble getting some of them back, actually, because obviously the need is still out there for those other government departments to have that extra support, extra manpower, and or lady power too. So yeah, so they're not fully staffed at the moment, but they hope to be by the end of December.
Okay.
So as we come to the end of the session, then just a few things that we wanted to flag up, and a time to actually remind you of some of the things that we are doing for you. The Connect events. I hope that many of you have made the best use of these free online events that we have going. We look at various topics. They're done via Zoom meetings, so we can see everybody on the screen and you can see us. And it is a chance really to talk to providers from other areas and just to share good practice. So what we actually do is just facilitate discussion amongst providers. What we also have is an Alliance Connect event, which is I suppose like a conference, which is happening on the 25th of November between the hours of 4 and 8 p.m. And you can dip in and out of this. There will be a charge for the conference. And we have some fantastic speakers. We've got Ofsted coming. We've got the TV personality, Andy Peters, who's actually opening the event. So it's a really excellent chance to hear from experts in the sector about what's happening, and again, to actually share your experiences as well. We've got our future webinars coming up. The next one will be, I've mentioned Ofsted, and the next webinar that we've got planned will be in November. The date will be announced shortly, and this will be looking at how you prepare for your Ofsted inspection in light of some of the changes that we know will be happening, and how actually you can look at the inspection criteria in a different way, looking at the circumstances for your setting now. For example, if you talk in terms of leadership and management, one of the inspection criteria would be how the manager actually supports the emotional well-being of staff. And obviously we look at that very differently now to how we would have done at the beginning of this year, as we think about how we support mental health and well-being through coronavirus.
Just on the inspection, sorry Mel, just had a question. Does the referral policy changes only apply to educational establishments that are in Tier 4? I'm assuming not, because those are... No, that's generally now. Is that the case?
Yes, yeah, the deferral policy, yes.
Yeah,
Ofsted have laid out the criteria, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it talks about where local circumstances mean that it is not possible for the inspector to come and visit your setting. Bearing in mind that it is a face-to-face inspection, the inspectors will come out, will attend your setting pretty much as they would normally prior to coronavirus, but obviously there will be certain things that the inspector will do. They will wear a face mask, they will respond to how you want them to behave, and they will respond to the procedures that you've got in place in your setting. And that might include actually that the majority of the feedback and the pre or some walk around talk will be done outdoors.
Yes, of course.
So, you know, Ofsted are trying to be responsive to your needs as well, in terms of how they inspect you. And very excitingly, in terms of the resources that we've got coming up, there will be a new publication which we're hoping to get out to you in March, which actually looks at how you support the educational programmes in your setting in light of the new EYFS that's coming into force from September 2021. So we will also be putting on a suite of training and creating other resources, all of which are targeted at EYFS September 2021. And also a plug for our consultancy services. This is a new service that we're advertising in our Alliance shop at the moment, where actually you can have direct access to one of our early years experts, and we can shape our support in terms of what you actually need. So you're asking the questions and we're providing the answers. Michael, is there anything you want to add in terms of what's coming up and what to look out for as we move forward?
No, I think it is, as you've mentioned before, with a rapidly changing circumstances. I think just the Alliance's question and answer page on the website has been rightly praised from across the sector in terms of the speed and accuracy of what has been presented, but also just to keep looking back, because things are changing at a pace, and that's by far the best place to find information from us. And we pride ourselves on how accurate and timely that is. So hopefully that's what people have been doing anyway, but if not, I would encourage them to do so.
And I think, Michael, that probably is it for the session, unless you've got questions that have come in that that you'd like to put forward.
No, I think we've managed to weave them all through in due course. If there are ones which scrolled up through my screen at the time we were getting lots of questions, then I apologise for having missed them. So if that is the case, you've got approximately about another 15 seconds to put something into the chat box now. So, but I hope we've managed to cover them. I mean, as is always the case, I spend a few seconds waffling here just to give people time to type anything that they have, which is a last comment or question. And really just to thank, as ever, Melanie for her excellent coverage of a range of issues that we wanted to bring to people's attention, and really to thank everybody for attending with us on a cold, wet and miserable October night. But just to say, as I think Mel did in her rousing rallying cry, you should be, you've all done very well, in the words of old Mr. Grace, if I'm showing my age. But I think the sector should be rightly proud of how it has responded to the challenges of COVID, and we have every faith that we will continue to do so for the children and families that we serve throughout the long winter months and into the spring. And we will see you all again in due course. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, everybody. Good night.